A very good evening to everyone present over here. I'm Revati Satish, and today we are going to be hosting a panel discussion on the topic: Is democracy becoming an endangered concept of government? So, before we get into the discussion, I'd like to set the scene by stating that in recent trends, there's been a huge global backslide in democracy. So this trend mainly started in 1992 when a very famous American social scientist named Francis Fukuyama said that with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, we had reached the end of history, which kind of meant that now there would be no more wars, and the world was now accepting the West's liberal principles of government, and almost nearly every country would have democracy as its main form of government. So after 1992, a lot of countries underwent decolonization movements that had started after the Second World War, which continued into the new millennium. And democracies began to get established in newer countries. There was the Arab Spring during 2011, in which a lot of countries like Tunisia, a lot of Arab countries fought for democracy. But what we've seen recently is that in a lot of countries who claim to be democracies, there have been a lot of anti-democratic actions happening inside. There are no free or fair elections. There's been a tighter grip over the media. There have been a lot of anti-democratic movements led by countries' own leaders. So this brings us to the question, which is also the first question that I'm going to pose to all of my panelists, is that what are the factors that are causing anti-democratic global recession across the world? What has brought us to this point in time? And who wants to go first? Why don't we start with Sonia?
Perfect. So, I think that there is a combination of factors which are responsible for this. Maybe like the political hangover that comes after the pandemic or the Russian war. So, most importantly, the things that are dominating the scene are the structural factors that have created the pandemic, actually. And these are things like the existing grotesque levels of inequality between the communities and especially between genders that allow the societies to be pulled apart. So this under the polarization that is existing here, it undermines the capacity of the democracy to resist an authoritarian onslaught. And I think another reason that is responsible for this is the visible erosion in the faith in the liberal institutions as a result of the perception that democracies are not able to deliver in an effective way. So, backsliding of democracy actually, its core is the fact that people are losing trust in the ability of the legislature, and there is no, in their perception, there are no separation of powers when it comes to the executive and the legislature. And they think that if the executive is in full control of the situation, they are safer. And this is happening even in many high performing democracies, as you mentioned, that even in high performing democracies, there are lines that are blurring, which is leading us to this idea of ineffective democracies, and people are losing trust in the ability of the legislature to carry out stuff.
Right, right. That's so true because we've seen that happen in the US. I mean, the the January 6th Capitol riots. It's because people were so frustrated with the current ruling party, which was half the reason. And the second one was that the president who's in charge incited violence. So it was a culmination of people feeling agitated with their government, as well as people being hyper nationalistic, which ultimately culminated in that attack on the foundation on on the capital, which symbolizes democracy in the US. So very right. I completely agree with you. So, Tikshna, what about you?
So I would say that democracy, when it emerged as a concept, it always stayed. But the global south, which I would like to refer to, they started adopting democracy as something like a fad, to be honest, like because westerners were going through the same regime altogether, and considering that countries specifically like India were left alone after USSR's demolition, or I would say division and emergence of Russian Federation, we were kind of left alone. So there are many countries just like India, which I mean, they had no option but to go forward with democracy. And by democracy, even if we say that democracy holistically is like a package, but we have different roots, which is political and socio-economic as well. So there is like liberalist form of democracy, and which we used to follow socialist. And just because of we were like lacking support from everywhere, we had to go forward with the fact. So I would say that the major reasons of black siding that is focused on the anti-democratic concepts which have been spread nowadays, and some of these concepts are grievance fueled illiberalism, and second is opportunistic authoritarianism, and third is entrenched interest revanchism. Now what I feel right now is the emergence of opportunistic authoritarianism. We are in the point where these specific leaders have that much control over their democracies. Reasons could be many, like there are no contenders or equal contenders, but now it is moving in a different direction where these leaders are kind of becoming a, a model for every countries and everything. And again, as we always say, just like NATO countries, the NATO supporting countries were in the group, even the global south is trying to reflect what their policies are. And a leader with those policies or those approach kind of makes sense now, because now we have to go forward with development, the pure the definition of development which they have established. And for that, even if the democracy is backsliding, I think we are still in a nascent stage to understand that where this kind of democracy is going to take us, because now I would say that we have started a bandwagon strategy to follow the rich Western countries.
Thank you for that. I want to pick up on one of the points you made, but before I do that, I want to hear what Indrapal has to say about this. Indrapal, what do you feel? What has brought us to this situation?
I'm thinking about the point you mentioned about the economic downturns and recessions, uh, and I'm thinking about how the idea of democracy, or to say a political regime that a country has, and its economy, they go hand in hand. You mentioned Fukuyama. Even when Fukuyama talks about democracy, it's not democracy he talks about, it's liberal democracy he talks about. So the idea of economics is very much intertwined with the idea of a democracy. And interestingly, the countries which have not been successful democracies, where we have seen regime changes, they are the ones who have not been performing well economically. Take the example of Pakistan. Pakistan's economy for a long time has depended on windfall gains, in the sense that when there's a good monsoon or when there's a good agriculture, it blooms, and when there's not, it then it goes downhill. So and these are the countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, where we have not seen democracy fruiting as well as maybe in the West. So the idea of economics is very important whenever we talk about democracy. As for the recession that followed the COVID-19, so there's this theory called bubble economy. So there's a time when the bubble inflates in an economy, and then there's a time when the bubble bursts. So COVID was a period which was the period of the economy going downhill, and the time when this bubble busted. So what is important is how, I mean, as Sutikshna also mentioned, that some countries, while are socialist democracies, others are liberal democracies. So that is very important when a democracy is being conceived in any nation. It's a very important question: what sort of a democracy you are going towards? So that is a very important deciding factor. Thank you.
Lovely. So now I was listening to the three of you, and I picked out on some points that each of the three of you have made. So Sutishma, you said that democracy is a sort of a package, like you said, and that's an extremely interesting point that you made because it made me think of the fact that a lot of people associate a lot of things with democracy. We've kind of been led to believe that democracy is this magical solution where everybody is happy, everybody gets what they want. There is no spoken scope of failure. Everybody's represented, everybody's equal. You get great economic gain, great political gain, great social gain. But on the other hand, there are some people who argue that this gives people, this sets an extremely high bar which is unachievable in some sense because democracy is bound to have flaws, and it does. So there are some scholars who argue that this definition is way too narrow. This is only one view of democracy. And what we should instead be doing is we should just broaden the definition to include that a democracy is just a system of governance with free and fair elections whose head of state keeps changing periodically. So, do you think that it's because people have too much of a utopian view of democracy is why people are getting dissatisfied with the government and therefore they're asking for a regime change? And that is how democracy is slowly backsliding across the world. What's your take on that angle? Satiksha, we'll start with you.
Yeah. So, in this, I would say that democracy, I mean, from a very lawyer's perspective, like we have certain sections. We are like bound to certain sections and we have to interpret it accordingly. Okay. Now, democracy itself is a huge concept. We have like bits and pieces of autocratic concept as well, anarchy as well. I mean, this is the part and parcel of being democratic state. And now everyone, even China, kind of showcases itself as a democratic state by conducting election. It makes no sense. So I would say that for democracy, like the real democracy to be established, I would say there should be like a proper definition and proper concept and explanation that this needs to be done because to achieve that, everyone, you and I, we are like five of us are there and we have different interpretation about everything, and we cannot run a country or run this world to like make a huge like I would say a community just out of our own interpretation. And this is the like disadvantage of democracy as well. We are never on consensus. 100% consensus is never an aspect. So I would say that there should be a particular definition for democracy. Again, it's very difficult to establish that considering that everyone is from different socio-economic background, political advantages and disadvantages people see. But I would just stick to my point that there should be specific explanation and specific criteria to define that, if you have these many things going right in your country, then you're perfectly democratic. So yes, that's all from me.
Thank you, Satiksha. That was a really nice answer. Interpal, carrying on, picking up from what Satiksha just said, I have two questions for you. Question number one, is there a need to redefine a democracy? Because a lot of people, there are two sects of people over here. The first sect of people is people who think democracy is this wonderful utopian concept of government where everybody wins. And there's a second sect of people who said that no, it's not perfect. We need to broaden the scope of democracy to an extremely fine definition to understand what constitutes a democracy. So this is my first question of do we need to redefine what a democracy is? And question number two, if so, how would you define a democracy?
Okay. I think that's a very interesting question. Do we need to redefine democracy? First of all, I think democracy has already been redefined a lot of times. One of our professors at college, he usually says that the biggest disciple of communism is capitalism. Capitalism has evolved a lot under taking lessons from communism. So now we have the idea of welfare state. A welfare state is a democratic concept, but it works on socialist principles of supporting, of reducing inequalities, of redistributing wealth. So, to answer the first question, I would say that democracy has already been redefined a number of times in a number of ways, in a number of contexts. Secondly, as you asked whether it is too utopian a concept to hold together communities and people. I think let us agree democracy in itself has a lot of limitations also. One is, since to say it in simple terms, democracy is majority rule. That itself, Nietzsche, if you read Nietzsche questions that. He talks about something called elitist democracy, where elites are the people who should govern on behalf of masses, because Nietzsche believes that masses are not capable to take their own decisions themselves. So that has also been questioned in cynical ways at times. But that is a very important question to ask, whether the idea that we have of democracy is a utopian one. If you go back to history, when India got independent in 1947, it was a very important question with how should because democracy was such a large project to have, and to give voting right to all the people, when 18% of our only 18% of our people were literate, and it was called the biggest gamble in the history of the world, because how can you give democracy to a people who are illiterate? So it has been questioned, but then if you look at the success of India, I think a large credit of that goes to the idea of democracy. So no matter the limitations and shortcomings it has, I think it has been, if one allows the lesser of the evils, it has kept people together and promoted welfare in some ways. But having said that, I would agree that this is not a utopian uh, regime to have, and it still has a lot of room for change.
Points well noted. What about you, Soumya? Do you feel that there's a need to redefine democracy?
So my idea of redefinition is a little different. So because as you mentioned that this concept is too utopic and has such diverse interpretations, that I think adding more constraints to it only complicates the situation. So for me, redefining would mean acknowledging that the diverse interpretations and applications that are applicable across various contexts. And when I talk about context, it's not just about socioeconomic or geographic context. For example, a lot of people think democracies is participation of the people in decision making. Now, countries like New Zealand have set an example where people are there, they're a part of the public participatory assemblies. But if I think about it in the context of India or say China, the population is diverse enough to not let us come to a conclusion like that, right? So I think some things like that, like the socioeconomic context, would differ, and that would change how a democracy functions. But like having said that, there are certain fundamental principles, say like rights of people, or maybe things like the freedom of press and things like that, which need a redefinition when it comes to the idea of evolving technology around us. So the freedom of press was not that much of a problem until there was freedom of access. The access of people to information has increased, and that is where the idea of conflict with the freedom of press has gained more popularity. Now the government does it because earlier they had control on the number of people and the number of modes that were responsible for spreading information and misinformation simultaneously. But now, since there is no end to it, they have put in certain curbs. And if we view any curb as freedom to press, I'm not denying the fact that there have been violations of the freedom of press, and some of them have been grotesque. But there are also certain barriers that they will have to set in order to make that distinction between spread of information, equal access to information, and also access to misinformation. So I think some redefinitions are required based on the changing context in terms of technology and increasing awareness of people. But at the same time, there is more importance that should be given to different interpretations within a scenario than different definitions.
This brings me to the next part of the discussion where um, I bring up the concept of a dictator's handbook. So, do you think a lot of countries, the reason when the press, brings out criticism of leaders' anti-democratic behavior, a lot of leaders look at other dictators and say, you know what, they did it, so it's okay for us to do it. And there's a global acceptance of the fact that democracy is backsliding. For example, Donald Trump said when he lost the election, he would not give up. He would not let Joe Biden. There would be no peaceful transition of power, right? And he would do whatever it takes to ensure that he remains in power. Now, looking at that, when Jair Bolsonaro, when he was placed in a similar position, and somebody asked him, "What if you lose the election?" His exact words were, exactly, I believe in Donald Trump's motto of there will be no peaceful transition of power. There will be only three choices: either I remain in power, either I die, or either that there will be no more democracy. So, do you think that there is the backslide in democracy is also made more conducive by the fact that there's a dictator's handbook where dictators look at each other and say, he did it, so it's okay for me to do it?
Yeah, I would like to go first.
Sure,
Uh, s-
Satish.
yeah. So I would say in this aspect, I kind of disagree because democracy presently has not established that dictator's regime which we are aware of, because we still have some freedoms. For example, in India, we have fundamental rights, and it is well preserved by the several independent institutions in India. For our case, it's Supreme Courts. Time and again, we come across this interpretations by Supreme Court, which kind of, make sure that nothing is arbitrary or something. Considering the idea of dictatorship in general, so it is like a human nature where I think it's a famous quote that power corrupts absolutely, and absolute power corrupts absolute, something like that, right? So I would say with greater powers, people in a sense, leaders kind of get greedy with it, and they kind of indulge in their personal gains, and that's where we need to find a stop. So as Soumya was talking about barriers, though she was talking about in technological sense, that technology, there should be some barriers in misinformation, and there has to be regulation. So I think that regulation part needs to be understood not just by the government or the like ruling government, but by us, the representatives that we elect there, so that this power is um, kind of there's like there's no shift in interpretation of that power. So, for example, like what happened in Ukraine and Russia, it was devastating to know, and still there were a lot of political personal gains that were going through. And then I wouldn't like to comment, but a particular leader, uh, like in the front page of Times magazine or something, and it was just devastating to understand that your country is going through a lot of things, and you are just there in magazines and everything. So I would say that now is not the time where some dictator's handbook is established, but again, it's not an absolute like it's not a false statement that there doesn't exist any. So I know it's kind of a diplomatic answer at the end, but we are kind of going forward with the approach that you just explained. Yeah, that's it.
Right. Soumya, since you have your hand raised, we'll go with you next and
Yeah.
conclude the discussion.
Perfect. So I do agree that there is no dictator's handbook per se, but with intentions leaning towards self-interest, I think there is a particular playbook of strategies that people use and they apply things differently, though. For example, I think as Sutikshna mentioned about how power is causing all this trouble, I think this power is also giving them control over the narrative. So if you have to decide with the current context, if you try and become a hero in whatever context there is, you sail your boat. So, for example, in Turkey, the government has been it has been criticized for suppressing the expression of freedom, and under their leadership there have been widespread arrests of journalists and also of like activists. But what they've always done is that they've said that all this criticism is Western interference into their working, and the leader has always positioned himself as a defender of the Turkish sovereignty. And they say that whatever we are doing is because we want to stand against the external threats, the Western threats. And even like in India, if you see that there are several journalists who have faced critical circumstances, and they've all faced legal action or online harassment leading to like self censorship and stuff. But the government has always characterized this criticism, and they've always said that it's only because of national security concerns, and that is what they've used as their explanation on the restriction of free speech. So they somehow control the narrative and tell people that what we are doing is to protect you. And that is something that I've seen as a commonality, that they turn any situation into becoming like a hero, a savior. And I think there is no dictator's handbook, but yeah, there is a strategical playbook that they're all looking at. They see that becoming a hero is a heuristic. If people find out that they are being helped, that's it. That's what they care about. So I think that is something that is going on.
The public image is what matters. Indipal, you're next.
I would like to give a very brief answer to this. Uh, any ideology or system you talk about, there are a set of values. Democracy is a set of values. Socialism is a set of values. Welfare state is a set of values. And any set of values, any system comprising of values, is only as good as the people who are responsible for holding these values. You asked about the case of the latest American presidential elections. So we saw this, same phenomena happening there, where the value system existed, the constitution was the same, the regime was the same, but then people were not upholding that value. So at the end of the day, it boils down to what the values of people are, and who are the people who have, who are the custodians of those morals and principles.
Right. Thank you, Indipal. So I'd like to conclude this discussion and say that it's been such a wonderful roundtable. All of your points were so enlightening, and honestly, it gave me so many new perspectives, especially Sutishna. You brought forth a new perspective and made me rethink on my dictator's handbook point, which I now see very clearly. So I think to conclude, I'd like to say that democracy definitely does have flaws. It's not a utopian form of government. And I think that a democracy is only as, in the past, like you said, a democracy is only as strong as its people are. So as long as people believe in the foundations of their government, are willing to make sacrifices, are willing to coexist even if they don't get everything that they want, but for the sake of a greater good, which is peaceful coexistence and to live harmoniously in society, I think democracy will succeed. There are quite a lot of countries who are yet to see positive outcomes with their experiment with democracy, but I think that if these values are followed, it will be a success. So thank you all so much for joining this discussion, and we'll see each other very soon for the next one. Thank you.